Imagine a small seed planted in the rich, red soil of Virginia in the year 1732. This seed was George Washington. He was born into a world that was both old and new. It was old because it was part of the great British Empire, with its king and its long traditions. It was new because America was a vast, wild land, a place of immense promise and danger. George's family were landowners, what we might call middle-class farmers. They were not as rich as the great lords in England, but they were respected. Young George did not grow up in a palace. He grew up on a farm near a river. His playground was the forest. His school was the world around him. His father died when he was only 11 years old. This was the first great storm in his young life. It meant that his dream of going to England for a proper education, like his older brothers, was gone. Imagine being a child and seeing a door to a wonderful castle suddenly shut and locked forever. That is how it must have felt. He would always feel a little insecure about his lack of formal education. This feeling, this small ache of not being good enough, would push him his entire life. It made him work harder, read more, and listen carefully to everyone. There is a famous story about George Washington and a cherry tree. The story says that as a boy, he chopped down his father's favorite cherry tree. When his father asked who did it, young George bravely said, "I cannot tell a lie. I did it with my little hatchet." This story is almost certainly not true. It was invented by a writer long after Washington died. But people love this story because it captured something real about the man he became. It showed a person of great honesty and integrity. Even if the story wasn't true, the idea behind it was. His character was his greatest strength, like a strong tree with deep roots. Without the path to an English university, George needed to find a different way to make his mark on the world. He found it in numbers and lines. He became a surveyor. A surveyor is a person who measures land. With a compass and a chain, he walked through the wild, untouched forests of Virginia. This was not an easy job. It was hard, physical work. He slept outdoors, faced dangerous animals, and met Native American tribes. This work did more than just earn him money. It taught him important lessons. Think of being a surveyor as learning the secret language of the land. He learned to read the shape of a hill, the direction of a river, and the best place to build a fort or cross a stream. His maps were neat and precise. This job shaped his mind. He learned to be practical, organized, and patient. He was literally measuring the world, trying to make sense of it, to put order into chaos. This skill of seeing the big picture, of understanding the terrain, would become incredibly valuable later in his life when he was no longer measuring land, but the movements of armies. Ambition burned in the young man's heart. It was a clean, bright fire. He wanted to be more than just a farmer or a surveyor. He wanted to be a gentleman, a man of honor and importance. In his world, the fastest path to honor was through military service. He saw the smartly dressed British officers and dreamed of becoming one of them. His chance came when a conflict began to brew in the American wilderness. It was a struggle for control of the continent between two great European powers, Great Britain and France. This conflict will be known as the French and Indian War. At the young age of 21, filled with more confidence than experience, Washington was sent on a dangerous mission. He was to carry a message from the Virginia governor to the French, telling them to leave the Ohio Valley, a rich land that both sides claimed. It was a journey of hundreds of miles through a harsh winter. He nearly drowned in an icy river and was shot at, but he returned, a new hero. His journal of the trip was published, and people began to know his name. He had tasted adventure, and he liked it. His next mission, however, would teach him a different, more bitter lesson. He was now a young lieutenant colonel, leading a small group of Virginian soldiers. He ambushed a small French scouting party in a dark, misty forest. The event was messy and confusing, and a French diplomat was killed. This small skirmish was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. It helped to start the full-scale war. Shortly after, Washington and his men were surrounded by a larger French force. They built a crude, small fort and named it Fort Necessity. It was a poor choice. The fort was in a low, wet area, an easy target. After a day of heavy rain and fighting, with his men cold, wet, and out of ammunition, Washington had to do the one thing he hated most: surrender. He had to sign a document admitting defeat. To make matters worse, the document, written in French which he could not read well, said he had assassinated the French diplomat. This was a deep humiliation for the proud young officer. Imagine being a young, brilliant chef who dreams of opening a grand restaurant. On your very first night, the most important meal you cook is a total disaster. You burn the food, the guests get sick, and the restaurant is closed. That is how Washington must have felt. He had been bold, but he had been foolish. He had been brave, but he had been defeated. He resigned his commission and went home, his first dream of military glory in ashes. This failure was perhaps the most important lesson of his youth. It taught him that ambition and courage were not enough. He needed wisdom, patience, and a little humility. The fire of his ambition had not been put out, but now it burned with a wiser, more controlled flame. Washington did not stay defeated for long. He returned to the army, this time as a volunteer aide to a British general named Braddock. He was no longer the commander, but an advisor. He tried to warn the proud general that fighting in the American wilderness was not like fighting on a European battlefield. The rules were different here. The enemy would not march in straight lines wearing bright red coats. They would hide behind trees and fight like ghosts. General Braddock did not listen. He marched his army through the forest as if on parade. The result was a catastrophe. The French and their Native American allies attacked from the woods. The British soldiers, trapped and confused, were slaughtered. General Braddock was killed. In the middle of the chaos, Washington showed incredible bravery. 2 horses were shot from under him, for bullets ripped through his coat. But he was not hurt. He rode through the gunfire, carrying orders, trying to create order out of the panic. He helped to organize the retreat, saving what was left of the army. He had been in the heart of a terrible defeat, but he had emerged with his reputation for bravery not just intact, but enhanced. He had learned how to survive and how not to lead an army. After the war, Washington returned to Virginia. He married a kind and wealthy widow named Martha Dandridge Custis. With her came 2 small children and a great deal of land. He now became the master of a large plantation called Mount Vernon. For the next 15 years, there were no wars to fight, no great missions to lead. These were the quiet years, but they were no less important for shaping the man he would become. Mount Vernon was his sanctuary, his laboratory, and his kingdom. He loved this piece of land more than any title. He poured his energy into it. He was not a lazy country gentleman. He was an experimental farmer. He tried new crops, new plows, new methods of fertilizing the soil. He was always trying to improve, to make things better, more efficient. This was the surveyor in him, always measuring and improving. Managing a large plantation was like running a small town. He had to manage people, budgets, and resources. He learned how to be a leader in peace, not just in war. Asterisk. It is important to remember, however, that this peaceful life was built on a terrible contradiction. Mount Vernon, like many plantations in the South, was run by the labor of enslaved African Americans. Washington owned people. They worked in his fields, cooked his food, and cared for his home, but they were not free. This is a difficult and painful part of his story. In his time, slavery was legal and common, but even then, some people knew it was wrong. Washington himself grew to feel deeply troubled by it. He called it a sad and unfortunate business. But he was a man of his time, trapped in a system he had inherited. Later in his life, he would wrestle with this problem, but during these years, he was a slave owner. The man who would one day lead a fight for liberty was, at the same time, denying liberty to others. This contradiction is like a deep shadow in the bright portrait of his life. During these quiet years, Washington was also a respected member of his community. He served in the Virginia legislature, the House of Burgesses. He was not a great speaker. He did not give fiery, passionate speeches like some of his colleagues. He was a listener. He would sit, quiet and thoughtful, and listen to all sides of an argument. When he did speak, it was with simple, common sense. People respected his judgment. They knew he was not trying to show off. They knew he was a man of substance. While Washington was managing his farm, the world outside Mount Vernon was changing. The relationship between Great Britain and its American colonies was growing sour. It was like a relationship between a strict parent and a teenager who wants more freedom. The British government, deep in debt after the war with France, decided to tax the American colonies. They passed laws like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act. To the colonists, this felt deeply unfair. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. No taxation without representation became their cry. At first, Washington was moderate. He was a loyal British subject. He hoped for a peaceful solution. But he saw Britain's actions as a parent treating a child not just strictly, but unjustly. He believed the colonies were being treated like servants, not like sons. He wrote letters to friends, his anger and frustration growing. The protests in the colonies became louder and sometimes violent. In Boston, there was the Boston Massacre, and then the Boston Tea Party, where colonists dumped British tea into the harbor. Britain responded by punishing Boston, closing its port. This was the final straw. The colonies decided to meet together to discuss what to do. They formed the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Washington was chosen as one of the delegates from Virginia. He traveled to Philadelphia, and famously, he wore his old military uniform. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His uniform spoke for him. It was a quiet signal. It said, "I am a man of peace, a farmer, but I have been a soldier before, and if this trouble turns to war, I am ready to serve again." The trouble did turn to war. In April 1775, British soldiers and American militiamen fired at each other at Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world had been fired. The American Revolution had begun. The Second Continental Congress gathered, and they faced a huge question. Who would lead their new, unofficial army? They needed a commander. The choice fell on George Washington. Why him? It wasn't because he was the most brilliant military mind in America. It was for a mix of practical and personal reasons. First, he was from Virginia, the largest and richest colony. Choosing a Virginian would show that this was not just a Boston rebellion, but an American cause. Second, he had military experience from the French and Indian War. It was mixed experience, full of failure and success, but it was more than most others had. But the most important reason was his character. The delegates saw in him a man who was steady, responsible, and, most importantly, not hungry for power. They were fighting against a king. The last thing they wanted was to create a new one. In Washington, they saw a man who would serve the cause, not himself. When he was offered the command, he accepted it with great humility. He said he did not think he was capable of the task. He even refused to be paid for his service, asking only that his expenses be covered. He was not a man who sought power. Power had sought him. So the farmer of Mount Vernon put away his tools and put on his uniform once more. He rode to Boston to take command of the Continental Army. What he found was not really an army at all. It was a collection of farmers and shopkeepers with guns. They were enthusiastic but undisciplined. They had no uniforms, not enough food, and very little gunpowder. His opponent was the British Army, the most powerful and professional fighting force in the world. Washington's task was immense. It was like being asked to build a great ship in the middle of a hurricane, using only scrap wood and a handful of tools. His first great challenge was simply to hold this army together. His first victory was a masterpiece of patience and strategy. He surrounded the British in Boston, and one night, his men secretly dragged heavy cannons to the top of a hill overlooking the city. The British woke up to find themselves in an impossible position. Without a single shot being fired in a major battle, they sailed away. It was a huge victory for morale, but the war was just beginning. The next stage was a disaster. The British returned with a massive fleet and army, and they attacked New York. Washington's inexperienced army was no match for them. He was outgeneraled and outfought. He lost battle after battle. His army was forced to retreat again and again. They were pushed out of New York, across New Jersey. The Continental Army began to melt away. Soldiers, their enlistments over, simply went home. The weather grew cold. The men were hungry, and their clothes were rags. The dream of independence seemed to be dying. This was Washington's darkest hour as a commander. His army was a shadow of its former self. Hope was a flickering candle in a strong, cold wind. Many people said the war was lost, but Washington refused to give up. His greatest strength was not his strategy on the battlefield, but his sheer, stubborn will to endure. He was the rock that would not break. In the cold winter of 1776, with his army on the verge of disappearing completely, he decided to do something audacious, something desperate. He decided to gamble everything. Imagine a poker player down to his last few chips. He can either walk away with nothing, or he can push all his chips into the center of the table for one last hand. Washington decided to go all in. On Christmas night, in a terrible storm of snow and sleet, he led his small army across the icy Delaware River. The river was full of floating chunks of ice. The conditions were brutal. They then marched 9 miles in the dark to Trenton, New Jersey, where a group of Hessian soldiers, German mercenaries fighting for the British, were camped. The Hessians, feeling safe, were celebrating Christmas. They were completely surprised. The battle was short and decisive. The Americans captured nearly 1,000 prisoners. A few days later, Washington did it again. He slipped away from a larger British army and attacked them from behind at Princeton. These 2 small victories were not militarily decisive. They did not win the war, but they changed everything. They were like a lightning bolt in the dark. They breathed hope back into the American cause. They showed that the Continental Army was not dead. They showed that Washington was not just a retreating general, but a leader who could be bold and brilliant. He had saved the Revolution. The war, however, was far from over. It would drag on for years, a long, grinding war of attrition. There would be more defeats, like the loss of the capital city, Philadelphia. And there would be another, even harder test of endurance, the winter at Valley Forge. After the British captured Philadelphia in 1777, Washington led his exhausted army to a place called Valley Forge for the winter. This was not a battle. This was a struggle for survival. The conditions were horrific. The soldiers lived in crude log huts. They had little food, little clothing, and no shoes. Disease and hunger were more dangerous enemies than the British. Hundreds, even thousands, of men died. The army was on the brink of collapse. Valley Forge was the crucible that forged the Continental Army. A crucible is a container used by a blacksmith. He puts a raw piece of metal inside and heats it in a fire until it is glowing hot. He burns away all the impurities. What is left is pure, strong steel. Washington was the blacksmith at Valley Forge. He held the army together in that terrible fire. He shared his soldiers' suffering. He walked among them. He talked with them. He kept their spirits from breaking. He spent his own money to buy them supplies. He fought against a weak Congress for more support. He was the unshakable center of faith. During that same winter, something else important happened. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben arrived. He was an expert in military drill and discipline. He took the ragged survivors of Valley Forge and began to train them. He taught them how to march, how to use their bayonets, how to fight like a professional army. When the army marched out of Valley Forge in the spring, it was a different army. It was smaller, but it was tougher, more disciplined, and more confident. It was now truly an army, not just a militia. Another crucial development was the alliance with France. After a key American victory at Saratoga, a battle Washington was not at, the French were convinced that the Americans had a real chance to win. They officially entered the war on the American side. This was a game changer. The French sent money, weapons, soldiers, and most importantly, a navy. The war was now a global conflict. Great Britain could no longer focus all its power on America. The final years of the war were a complex chess match played across the continent. Washington's strategy was not necessarily to win every battle. His strategy was to keep his army alive. As long as the Continental Army existed, the Revolution was alive. He knew he didn't have to destroy the British Army. He just had to make the war so long, so expensive, and so difficult that the British people would get tired of it and give up. The final move of this chess game came in 1781 in a small Virginia port town called Yorktown. A large British army under General Cornwallis had marched into Virginia and set up a base at Yorktown, waiting for the British Navy to bring supplies and reinforcements. Washington saw his chance. It was a risky and brilliant plan. He coordinated with the French army and the French Navy. He pretended he was going to attack New York again, tricking the main British army there. Instead, he secretly marched his army hundreds of miles south to Virginia. At the same time, the French Navy sailed up and blocked the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis from the sea. It was a perfect trap. Cornwallis was caught. The combined American and French armies surrounded him on land, and the French Navy blocked his escape by sea. He was in a checkmate position. After a siege of several weeks, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army. When the British soldiers marched out to surrender, legend says their band played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." And it had. The small, ragged army of colonists had defeated the mightiest empire on earth. The war was effectively over. America had won its independence. Victory in war is one thing. Building a lasting peace is another. In the years after Yorktown, a new danger appeared. This danger came not from the British, but from within. The army was still camped in Newburgh, New York. The soldiers had not been paid for years. Congress was weak and broke. The soldiers were angry and felt betrayed by the country they had fought to create. A group of officers began to whisper. They talked about marching on Congress and taking power for themselves. They even suggested that Washington should become their king. This was the ultimate test of Washington's character. He had fought a war against a king. Now his own men were offering him a crown. A man like Napoleon or Caesar would have seized this opportunity. Washington was horrified. He called a meeting of his officers. He planned to give a speech, urging them to be patient and to trust in the new country. He began to read his speech, but he stumbled over the words. Then he stopped. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a pair of eyeglasses. His men had never seen him wear glasses before. He put them on and said, quietly, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." In that one, simple, human moment, the anger in the room melted away. The officers were reminded of how much their commander had sacrificed, just as they had. They saw not a king, but a tired old soldier, their leader who had shared all their hardships. Many of them began to weep. The conspiracy, the threat of a military takeover, died in that room. Washington had won his greatest victory, not with a sword, but with a pair of glasses and the quiet power of his own humility and integrity. With the war won and the army peacefully disbanded, Washington did something that amazed the world. He gave up his power. He went before Congress, formally resigned his commission as commander-in-chief, and went home. He wanted nothing more than to return to his beloved Mount Vernon, to be a farmer again. Think of it. A triumphant general, the most powerful and popular man in the country, voluntarily walks away from power. This was almost unheard of in history. It was the act of a true Republican hero, like the Roman general Cincinnatus, who saved Rome and then returned to his farm. This act solidified his legendary status. It proved that the trust people had placed in him was not misplaced. He truly served the cause, not himself. But the country he had fought for was not yet a country. It was a loose collection of 13 states, held together by a weak agreement called the Articles of Confederation. The central government had no power to tax, no power to regulate trade, and no power to enforce its laws. The new nation was like a ship with 13 different captains, all trying to steer in different directions. It was drifting towards chaos. The states argued with each other. The economy was a mess. There were rebellions, like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, where poor farmers rose up against the government. Many people feared that the great experiment of American liberty was about to fail. Once again, the country turned to Washington. He was called out of his happy retirement to lead a convention in Philadelphia in 1787. The purpose of this convention was to fix the Articles of Confederation. But the delegates soon realized they needed to start over. They decided to write a whole new plan of government, the United States Constitution. Washington was unanimously elected president of the convention. He did not participate much in the debates. That was not his style. But his presence was crucial. He sat in the president's chair, a silent, steadying force. His presence gave the meeting legitimacy and seriousness. Everyone knew that he was there, and that gave them the courage to do the hard work of compromise. He was the anchor that held the convention together during its stormy debates. After a long, hot summer, they produced the Constitution, a brilliant and enduring framework for a new kind of government. The Constitution had to be approved by the states, and then a new government had to be formed. And everyone knew who would have to be its first leader. Once again, Washington did not want the job. He was old, he was tired, and he loved his life at Mount Vernon. He felt, as he wrote to a friend, like a man being sent to his own execution. But he also knew that if he refused, the new government might never get off the ground. The ship he had helped build needed a captain to guide it on its first voyage through dangerous, uncharted waters. So, with a heavy heart, he accepted the will of the people. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. Everything he did as president was a first. He was acutely aware that he was setting a precedent for all future presidents. A precedent is like the first set of footprints on a path of fresh snow. Everyone who comes after will likely follow in those first steps. He had to invent the presidency. How should a president dress? How should people address him? He chose the simple, dignified Mr. President, rejecting grander titles like His Highness. How should he interact with Congress and the people? He created the first presidential cabinet, bringing into his government the most brilliant minds in the country, even when they disagreed fiercely with each other. His Secretary of the Treasury was the energetic Alexander Hamilton, who wanted a strong central government and a commercial, industrial economy. His Secretary of State was the brilliant Thomas Jefferson, who feared a strong central government and envisioned a nation of small, independent farmers. Washington's cabinet was like a team of rival geniuses. Hamilton and Jefferson were like fire and water. They argued constantly. Washington's great skill was in listening to both of them, weighing their arguments, and then making a decision for the good of the country. He was the calm center of the storm. These disagreements led to the creation of the first political parties, something Washington feared would divide the nation. As president, he faced enormous challenges. The new nation had huge debts. It had to establish its credit in the world. It had to deal with hostile Native American tribes on its borders and with the powerful nations of Europe, who were watching to see if the young republic would fail. A major test came with the Whiskey Rebellion. The government had placed a tax on whiskey to raise money. Farmers in western Pennsylvania, who often turned their grain into whiskey, refused to pay. They rebelled. This was a critical moment. Would the new government be as weak as the old one? Washington's response was firm. He called up the militia and personally led the troops, at least for part of the way, to put down the rebellion. He showed that the new federal government would and could enforce its laws. The man who had been a rebel against a distant government now showed that he would not tolerate rebellion against a government of the people. In foreign policy, he guided the nation with a steady hand. When war broke out between France and Great Britain, many Americans, especially Jefferson, wanted to help France, their ally from the Revolution. Others, like Hamilton, wanted to side with Britain, their main trading partner. Washington made a difficult but wise decision: neutrality. He declared that America would not take sides. The country was too young, too weak, and too fragile to get involved in Europe's wars. It needed time to grow strong. This policy of neutrality was unpopular with many, but it kept the nation safe. After 2 terms as president, 8 long and difficult years, Washington made his final, great contribution to American democracy. He decided to step down. He could have easily been elected for a 3rd term, probably for life. People would have gladly kept him, but he knew that a peaceful transfer of power was essential for a republic. The leader must not become permanent. He was tired, and he wanted to show the world that power could be passed from one person to another peacefully, according to the rule of law. Before he left office, he gave the country one last gift, his farewell address. It was not a speech, but a long letter published in the newspapers. It is one of the most important documents in American history. In it, the old general and president offered his final advice to the nation he loved. He warned against the dangers of political parties, fearing they would divide the country. He warned against getting too involved in foreign alliances and wars. And he urged his countrymen to cherish their union, to think of themselves as Americans first, before they were Virginians or New Yorkers. It was the advice of a wise father to his children. At last, George Washington went home to Mount Vernon. He was finally just a farmer again. He enjoyed 2 quiet years, riding his horse around his fields, managing his estate, and enjoying his family. In December 1799, he went out for a long ride on a cold, wet day. He came back with a sore throat. It quickly grew worse. In the medical practice of the day, his doctors bled him, which only made him weaker. Within 2 days, he was gone. He died peacefully in his own bed, in his own home. He was 67 years old. The news of his death brought a wave of grief across the nation and the world. The man who had been the indispensable figure in the American story was gone. So what is his legacy? Why do we remember him? George Washington was not the most brilliant general in history. He was not the most profound political philosopher. He was not a great orator. His genius was of a different kind. It was a genius of character. He had a deep sense of duty, a profound integrity, and an unshakable will. He was the man who could be trusted. He was trusted to lead the army, trusted to lead the convention, trusted to lead the new nation, and trusted to give up power when the time came. His life was a journey of constant growth. The ambitious young man who sought personal glory became the patient general who sought only his country's survival. The slave owner who accepted the system he was born into grew to despise it, and in his will, he freed the enslaved people he owned, the only one of the founding fathers to do so. The reluctant leader who always preferred his farm to public office answered the call of duty again and again. If the United States is a great building, George Washington is its foundation. Others were the beautiful windows, the soaring columns, or the clever architecture. But he was the strong, solid stone buried in the ground, holding everything else up. He was not a god. He was a man, with flaws and contradictions. But through his choices, his sacrifices, and his unwavering character, he became the father of his country and a symbol of leadership for the ages. The seed that was planted in the Virginia soil had grown into a towering tree, one that provided the shade under which a new nation could grow. And that is a story that will always be worth telling.